The Red Death had devastating law on the country. No precedent had ever been so fatal, so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding of the pores with desolation. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of its victims, where the past band would shut him out from aid and from sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the illness were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominants were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusions of his castle base. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own ecstatic yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall guarded it. This wall grates of iron. The corridors, having entered, brought furnaces and Masque hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or frenzy from within. The abbey was implied provisioned. With such precautions, the corridors might by defense to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was a folly of grief to think the prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisators, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these in security within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward close to the 5th and 6th month of his seclusion, and while the Bastillers raged most furiously aboard, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a vulturous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors side back nearly to the walls on the other hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. Sorry if I said that wrong. The apartments were so irregular disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle, in each hall, a tall, narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were stained glass, whose colors varied in accordance with the prevailing hues of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That it is the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue. A vivid blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the pants were purple. The third was green throughout, so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange. The fifth was white. The sixth was violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet, tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down to the floors, falling in heavy loads upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber, only the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The pans here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there a lamp or candelabrum. Amid the fusion of the golden ornaments that scattered to and fro or depended from the roof, there was no light of any kind emitting from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the west, or the black chamber, the effects of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings, though through the blood-tinted panes, were ghastly in the extreme. It produced so wild a look upon the courtiers of those who entered that they were few of the company, bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour has been striking, there will come from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar notes, and emphasized that at each lapse of the hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken a sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the gaze grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked around each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows to each other that the next time the chiming of the clock should produce in a similar emotion, and then after the lapse of 60 minutes, there can yet another chiming of the clock, and then with the same disconcert and tremendously meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric leisure. There are so many who have thought made him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear, to see, and to touch him, to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7th chamber upon occasion of the great fete, and it was his only gilding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they grosserie. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm. Much of what has been seen in the Herprene. There was arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the maiden fashioned. There was so much beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that, which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers, there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams, and these dreams withered in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echoes of the steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then for a moment all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instinct, and a light, half-suburban laughter floats after them as they depart and now go. The music swells, and the dreams live, and rife to fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many tinted windows, through which the rays from the tripods. But to the chambers which lies the most westerly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture for the night is waning away, and the flows of ruddery light through the blood-colored pans, and the blackness of the sable draping pales, and to him whose feet falls upon the simple carpet, there comes from the new clock of ebony muffled peal, more solemn and pathetic than any which reaches the ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly of human life, and the reveal went wearily on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened. Perhaps more of thought crept with more and more time into meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus too it happened perhaps that the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sank into silence. There were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisures to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of the new presence having spread itself whisperingly around there, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of deposition and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In the assembly of phantoms, such as I have painted, it may be supposed that ordinary appearances could have excited such sensation. In the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, But the figure in the question were heralded and gone before the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are the chords in the hearts of the bounds, even the prince more reckless life and deaths are equally just. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply into the costume, and bearing up the stranger, neither wit nor property existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to toe in the habitations of the grave. The mask which sealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble countenance of stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might be eliminated if not approved by the mad revels around. But the manner had gone as far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His gesture was dabbed in blood, and his blood brow, with all the features of his face, was pre-sprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this specular image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to withstand its roll, stalked to and fro on the waters, he seemed to be convulsive, and the next morning the strong shudder, either terror or deceit, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who cares?" he demanded hoarsely to the courtiers who stood near him. "Who dares insult us with these blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise for the battlements." It was in the western and blue chambers, in which stood Prince Prospero, as he uttered those words. They ran throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust, and that music had become hushed at the waving of his hands. It was in the blue room where they stood, the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of intruder, which at the moment was also near at hand, and now where the deliberate and safety step made closer approach to the speaker, but from certain a nameless awe, from which the mad assumptions of the person, and while the vast assemble, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centuries of the floors to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and the same step which he distinguished from the first, though the blue and purple chambers, and the tidal purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddened with rage and ashamed of his own cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of the deadly terror that seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger. It had approached in rapid imprudence to within 3 or 4 feet of the retiring figure, with the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and a dagger dropped gleamingly upon the sable carpet, upon which, instantly afterwards, fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the murmurs, whose tall figures stood erect and motionless within the shadows of the ebony clock, gasped in unmentionable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like Masque, which they handled with so violent rudeness by intangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief at night, and one by one dropped the revels in the blood-bound halls of the revel, and died in each room Persephon's fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last day of the gay. And the flames of tripod expired, and the darkness of decay and the Red Death held illuminated dominion over all.